This video, I have to disclaim, has no agenda. It's not making an excuse for something else. It's not pursuing some other objective. This video is simply a reflection on something I think is meaningful to my own life, and it may or may not be meaningful to your life, whoever you are watching it. I just got a very hostile series of responses within Patreon from a commenter who is about 60 years of age. And this commenter asked me a question, fair enough, although it was brief and somewhat truculent, asking if I had it in me to change. If the type of tactics I've been talking about, why I make YouTube videos the way I do, why this whole project means what it means to my life, if I can change. And I think implicitly she's asking, or if I'm stuck in my ways. Now, in reply, I said, look, I'm someone who's had to endure really terrible, really dramatic changes, such as stopping everything I was doing in Cambodia, moving to Saskatchewan, and studying Cree. And I said, I've never known anyone who made changes that dramatic, of that kind. Switching from Cambodian as a language to Cree, switching from the politics of Southeast Asia, politics and history and religion of Southeast Asia, to First Nations people in Canada. So my point was, in answering, yes, not only am I capable of making changes of the type she asked about, which are relatively trivial, like why do you make YouTube videos the way that you do, but yeah, actually I'm someone who's undergone these sorts of dramatic and sudden changes. So this member of my Patreon forum responded to this in a way that was both defensive and offensive. Responded in a way that I've called in the past, just in my personal life, the Misery Olympics. Now, again, it turns out this unknown to me, this person about 60 years of age, and she writes back, in effect, saying, oh, well, you think you've gone through changes in your life. This is nothing. Here are the changes I've gone through, and making a great boast of her own sorrow and her own suffering. I think this is a habit of mind we all have to learn to overcome. I think it's quite natural when someone tells you that their parents beat them up as a kid to come back by saying, oh, well, my parents beat me up even worse, or to come back by saying, I know somebody else whose parents beat them up much worse than that. To try to respond to sorrow and suffering, someone sharing with you their sorrows, by trying to eclipse that sorrow, by trying to outdo that sorrow. But it's really wrong. I mean that both kind of ethically and tactically. It is really the wrong way to reply. Now, in this case, I was actually answering this woman's question, plain and simple. I was not making a great show of my sorrows in life. But it is true there was tremendous suffering for me in ending one career and beginning another that way. And that's something I've had to do repeatedly. And it was also true when I said, I don't know anyone who's made that sort of change. I could say more, but there's no point here. But that's all that means. I don't know. The people I've known in my life, I've never known someone who made that kind of change. Changing from Cambodian to Cree is an extraordinary and remarkable change. So if you want to come back to me by saying that it's not extraordinary or remarkable at all because of what you've done in your life, for one thing, you're missing the opportunity to just tell me who you are and what you've done in your life. It's sort of presuming that I wouldn't have a sincere interest in wanting to get to know you. And it's also presuming that I wasn't being sincere in answering your question, in sharing with you something about who I am. And I answered your question. So it's a peculiar thing. This sort of combative tone of, who do you think you are? Don't you know who I think I am? I think it's an attitude many of us have from childhood. It's certainly something I can remember in the schoolyard. I can remember being very common at an early age. And the counterposing attitude of recognizing, each person can have suffering that's tremendously meaningful to them personally, even if that suffering is perhaps trivial on a global scale. Like it may be trivial compared to the sorrows of the average Cambodian peasant who survived the rise and fall of communism in Cambodia. You can take one of these dramatic examples from history. But that is, in the truest sense of the term, spurious. Now, I've also been in situations where someone like a coworker chooses to tell you about great sorrows in their life. Say a coworker is going to tell you about a personal trauma, a personal tragedy, or that they were beaten up by their parents as a kid in some terrible way. And where you do have to say to them, look, I'm not the person you should be telling this to. It's actually not appropriate for you to share this with me. That's a very different situation. And that can be awkward. And I think there are kind of tactics you learn for dealing with that situation in its own way. But it's a very different thing if someone tells you, as I told this person, to answer your question, can you make a fundamental change? She wants to ask me. I say, yes. Not only can I make a fundamental change, I have experience with that. And I don't know anyone who's been through a similar experience of cutting off your life abruptly in Cambodia, starting a new life with Cree, with First Nations, etc. And this woman really wants to reply to me by saying, well, you ain't shit. The changes, the tragedies you've been through are nothing compared to what I've been through. That's a lost opportunity. Because I would be sincerely interested in what this woman has been through if she could present it in any format other than belittling me, insulting me, and turning this into a competition, as I say, a misery Olympics, when it needn't be. What I said was in no way an offense to her. What I said was in no way took away from her life or anything else. It answered her question, told you something about me. And she chooses to make this into a situation where it's a zero-sum game, where somehow my experience in life, my sorrows, and even my answer to her question can't have validity because she's somehow suffered in a way that's more important than how I've suffered. I think that's very sad, and I think in a profound sense, it shows a misunderstanding of what suffering is and why it matters. I mean, probably the greatest suffering I went through in my life was while I was in the hospital with my wife immediately after the birth of my daughter. And I could describe all the reasons for that. Now, objectively, the hospital we were in was wealthy. I've actually done research on hospital conditions in Cambodia, etc. I know what third world hospitals are like. However, it's also possible to have a completely wonderful and joyous occasion in a third world hospital, including the birth of a child. Now, the reasons why the situation in the hospital were so miserable, actually, a lot of them did have to do with veganism. Had to do with the attitudes of the doctors, the attitudes of the nurses, the hostility, managing a tremendously tense and miserable situation that shouldn't have been. But, the actual bed in the hospital was nice. The electrical lights were good. If you take a step back and photograph the hospital from the exterior, there's nothing wrong with it. And on the contrary, there's a lot right with it. The standards of hygiene in the hospital were not bad. You can make a list of all the ways in which this is a very positive institutional context to give birth to a baby. But nevertheless, if I sat down with a Cambodian person and explained to them the misery I went through, that, really permanent damage I carry with me for the rest of my life because of how harrowing that experience was at that hospital for me, even then it would be inappropriate for a Cambodian person to turn around and say, oh, well, when my wife gave birth in a hospital, the hospital wasn't fancy and beautiful and expensive like your hospital, so fuck you. So your misery counts for nothing. And again, there's a lost opportunity on both sides there. You are throwing away the opportunity to learn who I am, what I care about, and how my suffering has changed me. And you're also making it impossible for me to get to know you because you're presuming I wouldn't have a sincere and sympathetic interest in your background, in your experience. That I wouldn't welcome you to the table and I wouldn't recognize your suffering as something legitimate and important that I can learn from. Okay? So that's my commentary on the Misery Olympics as I talk about it. I think it is something natural It's a habit of mind that many people, not all people, have from childhood. And part of maturing is breaking that pattern, breaking that habit of mind, and disciplining yourself to listen to other people's suffering with a certain kind of detachment and a certain kind of respect. Because, ultimately, as with all these things, a man suffers not in what he feels, but what he knows. It's not when you scrape your knee that you suffer as a child. As a small child, it's when you look at your knee, you think about it, you reflect on it, then you feel the pain. You can scrape your knee and run around the schoolyard and keep playing for an hour. It's really not the event. It's what that event means to you. And the construction of that meaning ultimately is part of how we construct and construe ourselves, who we are. Someone else could have gone through my experience in Cambodia and learned nothing from it and felt nothing. And, you meet those people. There are people who did the same jobs I did, more or less, in Cambodia and Laos, and did it in a shallow, lighthearted way and, didn't suffer terribly one way or another and didn't learn much one way or another. That's true. We could do a whole video here about English teachers. People who teach English as a second language in Asia, some of them are just having a good time and couldn't care less or what have you. And obviously in a lot of ways, even though I did teach English in between other jobs, when I was teaching English for those short periods of time, I had a lot of things on my mind and on my heart that other English teachers might not have. So, how we suffer, there's just no sense in which that should be or must be, directly proportional to the problems themselves. Because with this type of suffering, we're getting into the question of what these events mean to us. What did it mean to me to have to give up my own future as a scholar of Cambodia, Theravada Buddhism, the history and politics of that region, and to start again from a blank piece of paper with the Cree in North America? Maybe you're not interested. Maybe you don't want to know. But that tells you a lot about me, about who I am, and about why those things matter to me. And I can imagine a fictional character who would have lightheartedly, without great sorrow, without great reflection, without caring, who could have given up one area of study and taken up another. But exactly what I'm trying to communicate to you is that's not me. I didn't do it casually or in a lighthearted way. This is tremendously meaningful to me and is a source of tremendous sorrow. So that capacity, and again, really, sympathy, the point of sympathy is not to wallow in emotion. I really think that the greatest significance of sympathy in our lives is as an analytical tool. And I think you ultimately have to invite people to get to know you by sympathizing with you, maybe both in your triumphs and your tragedies, not only in sorrow.